Respect is never taken. It is revealed in the moment someone thinks you don't deserve it. And in one quiet second inside a Manhattan dining room, that truth was about to unfold. The crystal lights shimmered above polished marble floors as Daniel Whitmore, a billionaire known for closing billion-dollar deals before dessert, swirled a glass of deep red wine without looking up, while across from him stood Emily Carter, a waitress most people forgot the moment she stepped away, her black uniform simple, her posture calm, almost too calm for someone working a 12-hour shift on aching feet. If you've ever watched someone get underestimated and knew something didn't feel right, you might understand what happened next. Daniel laughed softly at something his partners said, distracted, careless, and with a slight flick of his wrist, the wine slipped, spilling across the table and down onto Emily's white apron, staining it instantly. A dark red blooming like something permanent. A few guests gasped. One man chuckled under his breath, and Daniel finally glanced up, not with concern, but mild irritation. "You should be more careful," he said flatly, already reaching for his napkin as if the problem had solved itself. But Emily didn't apologize. She didn't flinch. She didn't rush to clean it the way most would. Instead, she paused, her fingers resting lightly against the table's edge, her eyes lifting, not to the stain, but to Daniel's wrist, to the precise tick of his Swiss watch, then down to the contract lying half-covered beneath his hand. The room shifted, almost imperceptibly, like air pressure before a storm. Emily reached for a cloth, dabbing the wine slowly, deliberately, and then, in a voice so calm it barely rose above the clink of glasses, she said, "That clause you're about to sign, it transfers 18% within 6 months. The laughter stopped. Daniel's hand froze mid-motion. Someone cleared their throat, unsure if they had heard correctly. And for the first time that evening, the most powerful man in the room looked directly at the waitress, really looked at her, as if seeing something that had been there all along but carefully hidden. "Excuse me," he said, quieter now, sharper. Emily met his gaze without hesitation, her expression steady, unreadable, as if this moment had already played out in her mind long before the wine ever spilled around them. Silence stretched, thick and expectant, and, though no one else fully understood what had just been said, they could all feel it. Something had shifted, something irreversible, and Daniel Whitmore, a man who controlled everything, realized he might have just lost control over the one thing that mattered most. Daniel did not move, not because he could not, but because something in her voice had stripped away the illusion that he understood the room. 18% was not a number someone guessed. It was buried deep inside a layered contract only his legal team and 2 executives had reviewed just hours earlier. He slowly placed his glass down, the faint clink echoing louder than it should, and leaned back in his chair, studying her now with a focus that made the others at the table uneasy. "Who told you that?" he asked, his tone controlled but no longer dismissive. Emily continued to clean the table, her movements precise, almost methodical, as if she had all the time in the world. "No one needed to," she said softly, adjusting the edge of the document just enough for him to see the clause more clearly. "It is written right there, just not where most people think to look." One of the investors frowned, leaning in, but Daniel lifted a hand slightly, stopping him without breaking eye contact with her. This was no longer a conversation for the room. It was something else entirely, something personal. The restaurant continued around them, quiet conversations resuming at distant tables, glasses clinking, waitstaff moving like a practiced rhythm. But at this table, time felt slower, heavier. Daniel tapped the contract with his finger. "This document was finalized this morning," he said, each word deliberate. "You are telling me you just happened to read it while serving dinner?" Emily gave a small, almost polite smile, the kind that did not reveal anything. "I am telling you that details do not hide just because people assume no one is looking." He narrowed his eyes slightly, and for the first time, there was no arrogance in his expression, only calculation. Across from him sat men who had seen him negotiate hostile takeovers without hesitation, yet now they watched him hesitate over a waitress. "What else do you see?" he asked, leaning forward, elbows resting lightly on the table, his voice lower now, more careful. Emily paused, then straightened, setting the cloth aside, her hands folding calmly in front of her. "I see a deal that looks profitable on the surface," she said. but gives control away piece by piece, until you no longer own what you built. Silence returned, deeper this time. One investor shifted uncomfortably. Another glanced at Daniel, waiting for him to laugh it off, to dismiss her, to restore the order they understood, but he did not. Instead, he reached for the contract again, scanning the lines he had already approved, now with a different lens, a slower pace. The confidence that had carried him into the room began to fracture, just slightly, just enough to be felt. "You are making a very specific claim," he said finally, looking up at her again, "and you are doing it in a room where you have nothing to gain." Emily met his gaze without flinching. "That depends on how you define gain," she replied. Something about that answer lingered. It did not sound like ambition, or fear, or even defiance. It sounded like truth, plain and unpolished. Daniel exhaled, quietly, leaning back again, his fingers brushing the edge of his watch as if grounding himself in something familiar, something measurable. But this situation was not measurable. It was not predictable, and that unsettled him more than any negotiation ever had. "Stay," he said suddenly, the word coming out before he could reconsider it. A few heads turned. A waitress did not stay at a billionaire's table unless invited, and even then, rarely accepted. Emily glanced at the stain on her apron, now fading into a dull shadow, then back at him, her expression unchanged. For a brief moment, it seemed like she might refuse, and that possibility alone made something shift again inside Daniel Whitmore. Because for the first time in years, he realized he was not the one deciding how this conversation would continue. Emily did not sit immediately, and that hesitation told Daniel more than any answer could. Because people who needed something from him never paused. They moved quickly, eagerly, afraid the opportunity might disappear, but she simply stood there, weighing the moment as if his request carried no special value. Finally, she pulled out the empty chair across from him and sat with quiet composure, not leaning forward, not trying to impress, just present, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt like he was the one being evaluated. "You read contracts like that often?" he asked, his voice measured, careful not to reveal too much curiosity. Emily folded her hands lightly on the table, her eyes steady. "I used to," she replied, and there was something in the way she said it, not regret, not pride, just fact. Daniel studied her face, searching for inconsistencies, for signs of exaggeration, but found none, only a calm that felt practiced, earned over time rather than assumed. "Used to," he repeated, as if testing the weight of the words. People do not just walk away from that level of analysis to serve tables. A faint flicker crossed her expression, gone almost as soon as it appeared. "People walk away from a lot of things when the cost becomes too high," she said quietly. The answer lingered between them, heavier than it sounded, and Daniel realized he did not know anything about the woman sitting across from him, not her past, not her reasons, not even why she was still here instead of walking away like most. What after being treated the way he had treated her? He glanced down at the contract again, then back at her. "If what you are saying is true, then this clause is not just an oversight," he said. "It is intentional." Emily gave a small nod. "It usually is," she replied. One of the men at the table shifted again, clearly uncomfortable now. "Daniel, this is getting ridiculous," he said under his breath. "We have attorneys for a reason." Daniel did not respond, because something deeper than logic was at work, something instinctive, the same instinct that had built his empire, and right now, that instinct was telling him to listen. "Walk me through it," he said, his attention returning fully to Emily. She reached for the document, not hesitantly, not boldly, simply as someone who knew what they were doing, and turned it slightly, aligning it with the light. "Most people read the main terms," she said, her finger tracing a clean line just beneath the surface text. "But the real transfer happens here, embedded in the timing language, tied to performance metrics that look harmless until they are triggered." Daniel followed her explanation, his mind moving quickly, connecting pieces, recalculating assumptions he had not questioned before, and with each word she spoke, the structure of the deal began to look different, less solid, more fragile. "You saw all of that in a glance?" he asked, unable to hide the edge of disbelief. Emily looked at him, and for the first time, there was the slightest hint of something behind her calm, not arrogance, not defiance, but certainty. "No," she said. "I saw it because I have seen it before." The room seemed to narrow around that statement, as if everything else had faded away. Daniel leaned back slowly, his fingers tapping once against the table, a habit he had when something did not fit the narrative he had built. "Where?" he asked. Emily did not answer immediately, her gaze drifting for just a second, not away from him, but through him, as if looking at something further back in time. When she spoke again, her voice was steady, but there was a quiet weight to it now. "In a report that crossed your desk 2 years ago," she said. "One that prevented a loss you never even realized was coming." Daniel's hand stopped tapping, his expression tightening just slightly, because there were not many moments in his career where he had been saved without knowing it, and fewer still where someone else had seen what he had missed. "What was the report called?" he asked. Emily's eyes returned to his, calm as ever. "It did not have a name you would remember," she said, "because the name attached to it was removed before it reached you." And in that moment, something unfamiliar settled into Daniel Whitmore's chest. Not anger, not confusion, but the unsettling realization that the person sitting across from him had been part of his story long before he ever noticed she existed. The name was removed, and that was the detail that lingered the longest. Not the report, not the warning, but the quiet erasure of the person behind it. Daniel's gaze sharpened, his mind already moving through layers of memory, boardrooms, late-night reviews, hundreds of documents that had crossed his desk, but very few had ever carried that kind of unseen impact. "That does not happen by accident," he said slowly, his voice no longer carrying authority, but something closer to scrutiny. Emily held his gaze without hesitation. "No, it does not," she replied, and there was no bitterness in her tone, which made it land even harder. One of the executives across the table leaned forward, clearly unsettled now. "Daniel, we are seriously entertaining this?" he asked, forcing a short laugh that did not reach his eyes. "She is a server, not part of legal." Daniel did not even look at him this time, because the distinction no longer felt as solid as it had 5 minutes ago. Instead, he focused on Emily. "If your name was removed, someone made that decision," he said, "and you are telling me you simply walked away from that?" Emily's fingers rested lightly against the edge of the table, her posture unchanged, but something in her eyes shifted, not visible to most, but enough for Daniel to notice. "I did not walk away," she said quietly. "I was made irrelevant." The words settled with a quiet weight, and for a moment, no one spoke. The restaurant continued around them, the distant hum of conversation returning, but at their table, the silence had a different texture now, heavier, more deliberate. Daniel leaned back, slightly, studying her again, this time not as a curiosity, but as a missing piece. "People do not become irrelevant by accident either," he said, his tone softer now, almost reflective. Emily allowed the faintest hint of a smile, not amused, not defensive, just acknowledging something understood. "Sometimes they do," she replied, "when they make others uncomfortable by being right at the wrong time." That answer did not feel like a guess. It felt like experience, and Daniel felt a subtle shift in his chest, something between recognition and discomfort. He had built an empire on being right at the right time, but he also knew, whether he admitted it or not, how often inconvenient truths were pushed aside to keep momentum intact. One of the investors cleared his throat, glancing at his watch. "We are losing time," he said, trying to regain control of the meeting. "This contract needs to be finalized tonight." Daniel's eyes flicked briefly to the document, then back to Emily, and for the first time, there was hesitation, real hesitation, the kind that did not come from lack of knowledge but from the possibility that what he knew was incomplete. "And if she is right?" Daniel asked, almost to himself, but loud enough for the table to hear. No one answered, because the question was not about the contract anymore. It was about judgment, about trust, about the cost of ignoring something that did not fit the narrative. Emily reached for the cloth again, gently wiping the last trace of wine from the table, as if returning things to order, but nothing about the moment felt ordered anymore. "You asked what I see," she said quietly, not looking at him now. "I see a pattern, and patterns do not change just because the numbers get bigger." Daniel watched her hands, steady, precise, and realized something unsettling. She was not trying to convince him. She was simply stating what she knew, and that made it far more difficult to dismiss. He leaned forward again, this time slower, more deliberate. "Then help me understand the rest of it," he said, his voice lower, almost an admission. Emily paused, the cloth still in her hand, and for a brief second, it seemed like she might refuse again, not out of defiance, but because she did not need to be here. And that realization shifted the balance once more. Because for the first time in years, Daniel Whitmore found himself asking not from authority, but from uncertainty, and that was a position he had never truly learned how to navigate. Emily did not answer right away, and that silence stretched just long enough to make everyone at the table uncomfortable. Because it no longer felt like she was responding to a question, it felt like she was deciding whether the truth was worth revealing. Daniel watched her carefully, every instinct telling him this moment mattered more than the contract itself. "You said patterns," he pressed gently. "Show me the rest of it." Emily set the cloth down slowly, her fingers lingering for a second, as if grounding herself. Then she reached for the document again. But this time she did not point at the clause he had been fixated on. Instead, she flipped the page entirely, revealing a section most people ignored. "This is where it changes," she said, her voice still calm, but now carrying something deeper, something final. Daniel leaned in, his focus narrowing, following her hand as it traced a line buried beneath technical language. "Performance thresholds," he murmured, recognizing the structure, but not the implication. Emily nodded slightly. "They look standard," she said, "but they are not tied to your company's performance. They are tied to external benchmarks you do not control." One of the executives frowned, shaking his head. "That is not unusual," he said quickly, almost too quickly. "It is common in international deals." Emily did not even look at him. "It is," she agreed, "when the benchmarks are transparent." Then she shifted her fingers slightly lower, revealing a reference code buried in the fine print. "These are not." Daniel's eyes locked onto the code, something about it triggering a memory he could not immediately place, but it felt familiar in the worst possible way. "Where have I seen that before?" he asked, more to himself than to her. Emily's gaze lifted, steady, unwavering. "The same place I did," she said. "In the report that never reached you." The room went still again, but this time it was not curiosity, it was tension. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly as the connection began to form, slow but undeniable. "You are saying this structure, this exact structure, was used before?" he asked. Emily nodded once. 2 years ago," she said, "in a deal that would have quietly transferred control over time, without triggering any immediate alarms." One of the investors leaned forward, his voice sharper now. "That deal never happened," he said. "We pulled out before it was finalized." Emily finally looked at him, her expression calm but precise. "No," she said. "Someone stopped it before it reached that stage." The words landed harder than anything she had said so far, because now the implication was clear. Daniel felt it fully for the first time, not just the possibility of a bad deal, but the realization that this moment was not new. It was repeating. His fingers pressed lightly against the table, grounding himself as the pieces aligned. "And the person who stopped it," he said slowly, his voice lower now, "was you." Emily held his gaze, not confirming, not denying, but not needing to. The truth was already there. The executive who had spoken earlier shifted in his seat, his confidence visibly cracking. "This is speculation," he said, but there was less conviction now. "You cannot base a decision on something like this." Daniel did not respond immediately, because something else had taken hold, something colder, sharper. He reached for the contract again, flipping back to the first page, then forward, then back again, scanning with a different mindset now, no longer trusting the surface, looking for the pattern she had described. And then he saw it, not all at once, but enough to make his breath slow, enough to make his certainty fracture completely. He leaned back, his gaze lifting from the paper to the man who had just spoken, studying him now with a new kind of attention. The room felt different again, but this time it was not uncertainty, it was exposure. Emily stepped back slightly, creating space, as if her role in the moment was already complete. "You asked me to help you understand," she said quietly, her voice steady. Now you do. And in that instant, Daniel Whitmore realized the situation had shifted beyond a simple mistake, beyond a risky deal, into something far more unsettling. Because the real question was no longer what was written in the contract, but who had written it that way, and why they had expected him not to notice. Daniel did not look away from the man across the table, and that silence became heavier than any accusation, because nothing had been said directly, yet everything was suddenly understood. The executive shifted in his chair, adjusting his cufflinks with a forced calm that did not match the tension now tightening his jaw. Daniel, you are overthinking this, he said, but his voice had lost the smooth confidence it carried earlier. These structures are complex, and it is easy to misinterpret. Isolated clauses. Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table, his posture no longer relaxed, no longer casual, but controlled in a different way, the way he sat when something mattered more than appearances. Then explain it, he said quietly. The man hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for Daniel to notice, enough for everyone at the table to feel the shift. Emily stood just behind the chair now, no longer part of the table, yet still the center of it, her presence quiet but undeniable. It is standard risk allocation. The executive continued, speaking more carefully now, choosing each word. You are protected on the front end, and any adjustments later are within expected ranges. Daniel did not respond. He simply slid the contract across the table toward him, turning it slightly, the same way Emily had done, aligning it with the light, exposing the detail that had been overlooked. Read that part again, Daniel said. The man glanced down, then back up, a faint crease forming between his brows. I have read it, he replied, but his tone carried less certainty now. Daniel's gaze did not waver. No, he said. Read it the way she just showed us. The table fell quiet again, and for a moment, it felt like the entire restaurant had faded into the background. The executive's eyes dropped to the page, scanning more slowly this time, more carefully, and as he read, something subtle changed in his expression, something he could not quite hide. Daniel saw it, the hesitation, the calculation, the moment where control slipped just enough to reveal what had been beneath it. If you are following this, Daniel said without breaking eye contact, his voice steady, almost calm, you are realizing the same thing I am. No one spoke, because now it was not about a waitress, or a mistake, or even a risky deal. It was about intent. Emily stepped back another inch, giving space, not out of fear, but because she understood something Daniel was only just beginning to realize. This was no longer her moment. It was his. You built your reputation on seeing what others missed, she said quietly, not interrupting, not pushing, just stating a truth that hung in the air. So the real question is not whether this is there. It is why it was there, and why you were not meant to notice it. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, because that question cut deeper than any accusation could. He had trusted this table, these people, this process, and now that trust felt less solid, less certain. One of the other investors shifted uncomfortably, glancing between them. This is getting out of hand, he said, his voice lower now, almost cautious. We are making assumptions based on incomplete information. Daniel finally leaned back, exhaling slowly, his fingers brushing the edge of his watch again, a habit returning when the situation no longer followed predictable lines. Incomplete information is what gets people into trouble, he said, his voice calm but firm. Complete information is what gets them out. He looked at Emily then, not as a waitress, not as an outsider, but as someone who had already seen this pattern before, someone who had lived through the version of this moment he was only now stepping into. You saw this 2 years ago, he said, and no one listened. Emily met his gaze, her expression steady. No one who needed to, she replied. Something about that answer settled deeper than anything else, because it was not just about the past. It was about the present, about whether the same mistake was about to repeat itself. Daniel looked back at the contract one more time, then slowly closed it, the sound soft but final, and for a brief second, the entire table seemed to hold its breath. We are not signing anything tonight, he said. The reaction was immediate, subtle but undeniable, a shift in posture, a flicker of tension, the quiet unraveling of expectations that had been set long before the dinner began. And if you were sitting in that room, watching it unfold, you might have found yourself leaning in a little closer, wondering the same thing Daniel was now beginning to understand, not just what had almost happened, but who had planned for it to happen, and what they would do next now that the plan had just been quietly, completely undone. The contract was closed, but the story was not, because silence like that does not end a conversation. It exposes the parts no one was meant to see. Daniel's decision still hung in the air, and for a moment, no one moved, as if the entire table was waiting for something to correct itself, for the night to return to what it was supposed to be, but it did not. Instead, small details began to surface, the kind most people ignore, but once seen, cannot be unseen. The executive who had defended the deal reached for his glass, but his hand paused just slightly before lifting it, his eyes flicking not to Daniel, but briefly toward the man seated beside him. A glance so quick it would have gone unnoticed if the room had not grown this still. Daniel saw it. He did not react, but he saw it. Emily saw it too, though she said nothing, her presence now quieter than ever, as if she had stepped fully into the background, yet somehow understood more than anyone in the room. We can revisit the terms tomorrow, another investor said carefully, his voice measured, attempting to restore balance. There is no need to make conclusions based on a single interpretation. Daniel nodded once, but his gaze did not leave the two men across from him, because something in that glance had already answered more than the contract ever could. Patterns, Emily had said, and now he was beginning to see them not just on paper, but in people. Tomorrow works, Daniel replied, his tone even, controlled, but there was a new layer beneath it, something colder, more precise. The executive forced a small smile, relief passing across his face too quickly, too obviously. Good, he said. That is the smart approach. Smart. The word lingered, and Daniel almost smiled, not because it was reassuring, but because it revealed something else, something subtle but important. People who were confident did not rush to label decisions as smart. People who were uncertain did. Emily moved quietly, gathering the empty glasses, her movement smooth, unhurried. But as she reached for the contract, she paused, just for a fraction of a second, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper, then withdrawing. Daniel noticed that too. You have seen this before, he said, not as a question this time, but as a statement. Emily glanced at him, then at the men across the table, her expression unchanged. I have seen enough to recognize when something is not what it appears to be, she replied. One of the investors shifted in his seat, clearly uneasy now. With all due respect, he said, choosing his words carefully, we are making this more complicated than it needs to be. Daniel finally leaned back, his fingers resting lightly on the table, tapping once, slow, deliberate. Complicated is not the problem, he said quietly. Hidden is. The room fell silent again, because that word carried weight. Hidden meant intention. Hidden meant design. Hidden meant someone expected him not to look closely enough. The executive across from him adjusted his posture, sitting straighter now, as if trying to regain control of the moment. There is nothing hidden here, he said, but this time, there was a faint edge in his voice, something defensive, something that had not been there before. Daniel tilted his head slightly, studying him, not the words, but the reaction, the timing, the subtle tension building beneath the surface. And then he noticed something else, something smaller, almost insignificant, the folder beside the man's hand, slightly open, revealing the corner of another document, one that had not been placed on the table earlier. It was not part of the agreement, not part of the discussion. Yet it was here. Daniel's gaze lingered on it for just a moment longer than necessary, then returned to the man's face. Nothing was said, but something had shifted again. Emily stepped back fully now, her role seemingly finished, yet the silence she left behind felt louder than anything she had said. And if you were watching closely, you might begin to wonder, just as Daniel now did, whether the contract was ever the real story at all, or if it was simply the first piece of something much larger. Something carefully constructed, quietly executed, and only now, finally, beginning to reveal itself. Daniel's eyes lingered on the corner of that second document, And this time, he did not look away, because instincts like his did not ignore patterns, they followed them. He reached forward slowly, not abrupt, not confrontational, just deliberate, and tapped the edge of the folder with a single finger. That was not part of the agreement, he said quietly. The executive's hand moved instantly, too fast, closing the folder just a fraction more, a reflex that spoke louder than any denial could. It is nothing relevant, he replied, but the smoothness from earlier was gone, replaced by something tighter, something controlled. Daniel leaned back slightly, studying him, not the words, but the reaction, because truth did not always reveal itself in what people said. It showed in what they tried to hide. Open it, Daniel said. The request was calm, almost casual, but it carried weight, the kind that did not need to be raised to be understood. For a moment, the man hesitated, and that hesitation shifted everything. One of the other investors glanced between them, tension now visible. Daniel, we are getting distracted, he said carefully. This is not necessary tonight. Daniel did not look at him. It was not necessary for the clause to be hidden either, he replied. Silence followed. Heavy, unmistakable. Emily stood still behind the table, watching, not surprised, not reactive, as if she had already seen how this would unfold. Finally, the executive exhaled quietly and opened the folder, just enough to reveal the document inside. Daniel leaned forward, his gaze sharp, scanning the page, and then he saw it. Not just a clause, not just a structure, but a signature. Not his, not theirs, but a third party, a name that had not been mentioned once that evening. Who is this? Daniel asked, his voice lower now, colder. The man did not answer immediately, and that delay confirmed more than any explanation could. It is a partner, he said finally, a silent one. Daniel's eyes did not leave the page. Silent partners do not control performance triggers, he said, his tone precise. They benefit from them. The room felt smaller now, tighter, as if the truth was pressing in from all sides. Emily took a slow breath, then spoke, her voice quiet but clear. He is not just a partner, she said. He is the outcome. Daniel looked up at her, and in that moment, everything aligned, not perfectly, but enough. The deal was never about shared growth, never about expansion. It was about gradual transfer, controlled, calculated, hidden behind complexity. The executive shook his head slightly, forcing a small laugh that did not belong in the room anymore. You are connecting things that are not connected, he said, but even he did not sound convinced. Daniel closed the folder slowly, his fingers resting on it for a moment, as if sealing the realization in place. No, he said quietly. I am finally seeing what was always there. He looked at the man across from him, not with anger, not yet, but with something far more unsettling, clarity. You built this to look like opportunity, Daniel continued. But it is not opportunity, it is erosion. No one spoke, because the word fit too well. Emily lowered her gaze slightly, not in submission, but in understanding. Because she had seen this exact moment before, just with a different ending. Daniel stood slowly, his chair sliding back with a soft sound that cut through the silence. And for the first time that night, the power in the room had fully shifted. Not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable. We are done here, he said. But the truth was, they were not. Because what had just been revealed was only the surface of something deeper, something more intentional. And as Daniel looked at the man holding the folder, he realized this was not just a bad deal. It was a plan that had been in motion long before tonight. And the only reason it had not succeeded yet was standing quietly beside the table, in a stained white apron. Power does not reveal who you are when everything goes right. It reveals who you are when something small forces you to see what you have been ignoring. And as Daniel Whitmore stood beside the table, the quiet weight of that realization settled deeper than any deal ever had. No one tried to stop him this time. No one laughed. No one dismissed the moment. Because the illusion had already been broken, not by confrontation, but by clarity. The executive remained seated, his posture still composed. But the confidence that once filled the room had drained into something far less certain, something exposed. Daniel looked at him for a long second, not with anger, but with understanding, the kind that comes too late to prevent what almost happened, but just in time to stop it. You thought I would not look closely, Daniel said quietly. And it was not a question. The man did not answer, because there was nothing left to defend, not convincingly. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything that had not been said earlier, every assumption, every overlooked detail, every moment where convenience had replaced attention. Daniel turned then, not toward the exit, but toward Emily, and for a brief second, the entire room seemed to fade around them. She stood where she had always been, calm, steady, unchanged, as if none of this had surprised her. He studied her differently now, not as someone who had interrupted his evening, but as someone who had quietly protected something he did not even realize was at risk. 2 years ago, he said. Slowly. You saw this before it happened. Emily nodded once, her expression soft but grounded in something stronger than pride. I saw enough, she replied. Daniel exhaled, a small breath that carried more weight than it should have, and no one listened. Emily's gaze did not shift. No one who was ready to hear it, she said. That answer lingered, because it did not accuse, it did not blame. It simply stated a truth that Daniel could not ignore. He had built a world where information moved fast, decisions moved faster, and people were often reduced to roles before they were understood as individuals. And tonight, that assumption had almost cost him everything. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a simple business card, then paused, looking at it for a moment before extending it toward her. Emily glanced at it, then back at him. And for a second, it seemed like she might not take it. Not out of defiance, but because she did not need it. And that was the difference. Slowly, she accepted it, her fingers brushing the edge lightly, as if acknowledging the gesture rather than the status behind it. You should not be here, Daniel said, not as an order, not even as an offer, but as a recognition. Emily gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Sometimes, she said, being somewhere unexpected is the only way to see what others miss. Daniel nodded, because now he understood. Not fully, not completely, but enough. Enough to know that intelligence did not always announce itself, that dignity did not need to demand attention, and that the most dangerous mistakes were not the ones made in ignorance, but the ones made in assumption. Emily stepped back then, returning to her role, blending once again into the quiet rhythm of the restaurant, as if the moment had never belonged to her at all. But Daniel knew better. As he turned to leave, the contract still resting on the table, untouched, he realized something that no negotiation, no strategy, no success had ever taught him. Respect is not given because of position, it is revealed by truth. And sometimes, the person you overlook is the only one who sees clearly enough to change everything.